Welcome, everybody. My name is Jennifer Griffith, and I work at NMOA, which is the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. And I'm showing the NMOA website. Fiona, can you see the website?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I've got this up here so people can read for themselves what NMOA is, but basically we're an interstate association. The 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey, work together on different pollution issues, waste-related, so the solid waste programs, the hazardous waste programs, the toxic use reduction, and those sort of programs, but also the waste site cleanup programs work together through NMOA. And one of the top priorities for the states through NMOA is training of state staff, but then also we decided that, hey, if the state staff is learning something, we should open it up to the wider audience so that everybody's sort of on the same page and learning the same things. So that's what we're doing here today. And also PFAS, of course, has also been a big hot topic with our states since about 2016. And so NMOA has done a lot of different activities on PFAS. So today we're combining the PFAS priority and the training priority together to learn, and we've got a couple great speakers. So I just want to let everybody know that after the webinar, within a few days, usually takes a few days, the presentations from today will be posted on the NMOA website. So I'm just going to really quickly show everybody how you can navigate there, and then also all the things you can find there. So, you know, this is just the regular NMOA website, NMOA.org. Then you go over here to the left hand, there's the waste site cleanup area, click on that. Then what comes up, waste site cleanup, basically you go to events. And then at the top are our upcoming events, and the things that are furthest out in the future are at the top, and then you scroll down. So you come to past events. So this is today's webinar. This was a couple weeks ago. We've had a bunch of great webinars on PFAS topics this spring, and these presentations are all posted here on the NMOA website. But we've also done things that are not PFAS. So folks that work in the waste site cleanup world, you might want to visit. We've done a couple of webinars on PCBs recently, and also vapor intrusion, and other topics. We did PFAS webinars last summer, so there's a bunch of those here as well. Some RCRA compliance, there's a lot of different stuff. And in the really old days, we did workshops that were in person, and so those are day-long workshops, so there's multiple presentations, and those workshops are also under, the presentations are also on the NMOA website. So there's a wealth of information you can find here. I will also send everybody who is on the webinar today an email when the presentations from today are posted. So you will get those. So today we've got a lot of folks attending, so welcome everybody. But there's way too many people to try to have people ask questions verbally. So we just ask that you type in your questions. There is a question box in the an area in the GoToWebinar control panel. So please type in your questions and send them. I'll be trying to monitor those, and I will ask the questions that come in. So you do not have to wait until the presentation's over to type in questions. You can type them in at any point. So please do that. So I think with that, that's all the logistics I need to do. So I'm going to launch right into our first presenter. So we are going to hear from Fiona Larame. Dr. Fiona Larame. She received her PhD in Environmental Science and Engineering in 2020 from Clarkson University, where she was under the supervision of Dr. Michelle Crimmy, who is going to be presenting on June 8th, all the research going on at Clarkson and the results. But Fiona is presenting about one of her projects. and Fiona joined the Southern California remediation team at AECOM in October of 2020. So she is, her thesis focused on development of a sonolytic reactor for in-Situ PFAS remediation. So that is what she's going to be presenting about today. So with that, take it away, Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for scheduling this. I know everything in COVID times is somehow so much busier. As Jennifer said, I'm going to talk about some of my research, but I also want to present, in a broader sense, what ultrasound or sonolysis can be used for PFAS, some of the considerations and applications for using it, and based on the results of our research, what we saw. So let me get started. Oh, there we go. There's a few key things to cover, sort of terminology and stuff that seems to come up often in questions after presentations, and I think causes some confusion because a lot of this is used interchangeably. So the first thing is ultrasound. So ultrasound is sound waves up greater than 19 kilohertz. And sonolysis, or more correctly, sonolysis, is what happens when ultrasound is applied to a liquid and the sound waves propagate through the liquid and create cavities. They're often referred to as bubbles, but to be correct, they are actually cavities because, and I'll explain this in more detail in a moment, but as the sound waves pass through the liquid, the cavities form as molecules are separated. So rather than bubbles, being blown into the liquid or something like that, it's cavities forming. And for those of you who have that memory of biology, cell lysis, so sonolysis, so when those cavities can only grow to a certain size depending on the conditions, and so they collapse. And when they collapse, high temperature and high pressure conditions, or before they collapse, those high temperature, high pressure conditions are created within the cavity. So when the cavity collapses, those conditions spread in the immediate vicinity. So these cavities are very, very small. We're talking micro scale typically. So, or smaller, or depending on the system conditions, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But the bottom line here is that that release of high temperature, so about 5,000 degrees Kelvin, are reported maximum in the literature. That's very, very local. So it's not that this tiny cavity collapses and suddenly 200 liters of water is at 5,000 degrees Kelvin. It's just on a very small scale. When Dr. Kirby and I set out to start on this research, we were looking at in-situ remediation options specifically, but throughout the course of the research, the applicability to in-situ or ex-situ conditions was a frequent topic of discussion. So there are pros and cons as far as sonolysis goes. So in-situ remediation overall reduces the likelihood of exposure or release of contaminants because you're keeping it underground. A treatment is occurring underground. And there are also options for low permeability settings, maybe more so in some cases than ex situ. However, ex situ is a little easier to work with because you can build in any direction at any scale that you want. You're not limited to delivery methods to the subsurface. And then a third thing that comes up a little bit in some of my later slides is the distinction between a known or an unknown. So a known for us was a PFAS that we had analytical standards for at Clarkson, and unknowns were those without analytical standards. They may not truly be unknowns because with enough analytical work, you could identify more of them, or if you have standards beyond the 24 standard method. And we did look into some of those unknowns a bit more, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions. So what helps to understand how the PFAS is, how senolysis applies to PFAS is how the cavities are created and how the PFAS interact with the cavities. So there are two types of cavitation. There's acoustic and hydrodynamic. We focused on acoustic. However, I believe there is hydrodynamic cavitation research specific to PFAS occurring, I believe, at Syracuse University in New York. So there, at least there was a few years ago, and that is also something worth looking into if you're interested. So acoustic cavitation is where we apply sound waves to a liquid. And as the sound waves pass through the liquid, these cycles of compression, rarefaction occur, and the little black circle that gets larger. So this is my interpretation of the cavity in the liquid. And so as that grows, it eventually reaches that critical radius and collapses. The result is not only high temperature, high pressure conditions that are created, but the damage, either damage to a surface or the cleaning of a surface that can occur. And it depends on the frequency and the material. So at low frequencies, closer to 19 kilohertz, the cavities are larger, and the total number of cavities in the system will be smaller. A larger cavity collapsing releases basically more energy, and that's where you start to see surface damage on softer surfaces. But at the same time, that can be really useful in certain applications. So ultrasonic cleaning, whether it's the lab unit that you might have or something larger used in the automotive industry, for example, those tend to be lower frequency units. And so a really good example is in the auto industry. If they want to clean dirt and oil and grease off of an engine, the engine materials tend to be more durable. So a lower frequency is great for removing built up dirt, etc., from those surfaces. But on the other end of the spectrum, there are higher frequency applications. So those at higher frequencies, the cavity size is much smaller, and the total surface area increases because more cavities are produced overall. And when those small cavities collapse, the energy released is diminished. And that's great for more sensitive applications. So in the broader industry, that might be microchip cleaning or wafer cleaning or something like that. It's also useful to consider the pros and cons of these frequencies for PFAS. So sort of backing up for a second, I just want to touch on the fact that senolysis and ultrasound for PFAS is not something that Dr. Kirby and I came up with. It's been worked on since at least 2005, as well as the application of senolysis to other water treatment problems. These are just a few examples from the literature. So it can be used indirectly. One of the great things about senolysis is that it has anti-fouling. It's essentially a self-cleaning system. In this indirect application, the authors reported on using it for alleviation of membrane fouling. In a senolysis only system, it can self-clean. So if you're worried about biofouling, it's less of a concern or not a concern in these ultrasonic systems compared to other remediation methods. It can also be used in tandem. So thinking back to that cell lysis discussion, that ultrasound can be used for bacteria inactivation along with chlorine or some other disinfectant. It can also be used in a direct system or even a direct and dual frequency system. So by direct, I mean senolysis or ultrasound only. And dual frequency would be using at least two, or you could use three or more potentially, but let's say two frequencies of ultrasound. And those can be used either simultaneously or alternating. The concern and the thing to be careful of in design is that if you use them at the same time, you don't want to have them potentially have those sound waves running into each other. So timing them and placing transducers that propagate those sound waves in just the right location is really key to make sure that that does not, that you don't actually end up canceling some of the wave propagation. So for some of the examples in the next slides, I wanted to just give a little bit of background on our design. So we went into this with the intention actually of using designing a destructive treatment system for PFAS that we could use in situ. And specifically, we looked at horizontal wells. The horizontal reactive media well was patented by Arcadis, I think several years ago now, and we had worked with them on that project, and worked with them a bit on this. So the idea is that groundwater by a horizontal well is passively captured through a screened portion. It's directed through an unscreened portion in the horizontal section, and then it's released through a screened portion back into the aquifer. And this is great because it is fully passive, so you don't have to pump water above ground, and that can save on energy costs. And that's, that was our starting point, was how could we reduce ex situ pump and treat requirements. And then we looked at other possible, so-called destructive treatment technologies, and ultimately settled on Senolysis based on available technology and scalability. So we came up with this is just a CAD depiction of a reactor that holds approximately 12 liters of water. And in the lab, we did this in batch tests, and in the field, or sorry, we didn't, but in the field, the intention would be to use this in a flow-through configuration approximately centered in the horizontal section of the horizontal well. So the lab version that we used operated at 430 kilohertz and 1,000 kilohertz approximately. We alternated between those because we used a transducer that has 2 frequencies built in. And then we completed experiments with both spiked DI water as well as groundwater that was already pre-contaminated with PFAS. So those groundwater experiments are the focus of the next couple of slides. And I just want to point out something about the treatment time. So we started with shorter durations of 5 to 10 hours at a time. We also found over the course of our research that heat is a big factor. So while the individual cavity heat generation is on a very small scale, you do see an increase in bulk fluid temperature over the course of a given experiment. And so about half of that time, of any given treatment time, is actually the reactor being on, while the other half is the reactor off and cooling down to control temperature. We have looked at, and we're looking at last year, ways to control heat effectively that could be readily implemented in the subsurface. So for example, a 36-hour experiment is actually about 18 hours of treatment time. So I think this is important to consider how the PFAS will respond and interact with the cavities. So what the general proposed mechanism is that the PFAS first align around the inner cavity interface. So with the hydrophobic, portion facing into the cavity interior where it's more water vapor, and the hydrophilic portion facing into the bulk fluid. So these will line up approximately around there. There are issues though of if you have a carboxylate versus a sulfonate and the chain length and how those interact. So longer chain lengths may dominate the cavity surface, and sulfonates may be more readily absorbed around the interface than the carboxylates. And there's also two mechanisms that have been proposed in the literature. The first was from Vasitis in 2008, and it was frequently referenced for the next 10 years or so. And this is essentially that that pyrolysis is occurring as a result of those high temperature conditions. So as the cavity collapses, the bond between the head and the tail group is first pyrolyzed, and then, depending on the PFAS, so for perfluorinated PFAS in particular, sequential defluorination may occur, or for polyfluorinated PFAS or perhaps shorter chain perfluorinated PFAS, a complete defluorination may occur. So it will depend on the system, and there's a lot more work to do to look into exactly how that mechanism proceeds and what conditions specifically are causing it. The other, last year was proposed that aqueous electrons are formed and attack between the head and the tail group, and then sequential defluorination occurs either via additional aqueous electrons or other radical species. There are also several possible byproducts. Fluoride, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and water were proposed by Vasitis, and hydrofluoric acid does come up as a concern. Vasitis addressed this in their method, in their mechanism. They pointed out that if hydrofluoric acid is likely to be formed in the cavity interior. And so when the cavity collapses, it dissociates into fluoride and hydrogen rather than continuing on and accumulating hydrofluoric acid. So there's a lot here, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end to clarify this. So the next thing is, so first it's how the PFAS are interacting with the given ultrasonic system, and that's really important to design it with that in mind. Some other considerations or related considerations are the energy consumption, and I'll talk about this a bit, the cost, the other constituents of the influent water to be treated. Organic matter and VOCs can reduce the treatment of PFAS. Organic matter, especially large particulate organic matter, may either sort of interfere or intercept pressure waves going through the liquid, where VOCs can accumulate in the cavity as it's expanding, and when the cavity collapses, actually cause kind of a cushioning effect that reducing the collapse energy and overall reducing treatment. The presence of polyfluorinated precursors became a large focus of my research because we found that and I'll show this, I think it's the next slide, as treatment progresses, and especially in the first several hours, many intermediate and precursor PFAS can be transformed into end products. And that raises those concentrations initially and overall can extend the treatment time needed, as opposed to those precursor or intermediate compounds breaking down and not accumulating. Other considerations are the reactor configuration, the volume, the materials frequency, power density, and the temperature. So all of these are factors that need to be considered, and it's something that we looked at as we worked on design and optimization. So one of the key questions we were trying to answer in our research was if PFAS contaminated groundwater could even be treated with ultrasound. So we looked at different site groundwaters. This is just one example. We looked at, it had a variety of compounds, as you can see, present. And overall, what we found, I know a lot of the focus for a long time has been on treatment of PFAS and PFOA. So 3% of the initial PFOA concentration remained after the experiment, and 10% of PFAS. That was very common to see, that the sulfonates tended to break down a bit more slowly than the carboxylates. Another thing, and it's sort of hard to see here, but we see increases in a couple of compounds. So for example, PFHPA, we saw an increase over time, and then a decrease in the last portion of the experiment. We even saw a bit of an increase in A2FTS here, not overall, but it does spike up again. And then I think there's PFBA was another compound that we did see increases in some cases, but not in this groundwater. And in fact, PFBA was probably our most commonly increased compound, again, but not at this site. And so that's is something to consider, that the individual site groundwater's compositions are important for how the treatment is going to proceed. So we took another look at the data and used the total oxidizable precursor assay to get a better understanding of what the precursor burden was before and after senolysis. So we used the same procedure in Houghton and Sedlak, where you combine your sample with an oxidant and heat, as well as a control, and then look at the change in PFCA concentration. So in this one, we have in red the control, so no oxidant, no heat, and no senolysis. In gray, we have, this is prior to sonolytic treatment, but the sample has been amended with oxidant and incubated. And then the black bar is the senolysis treated sample with top. And so what we see is that there's an increase from red to gray, showing that we started with quite a bit of precursor relative to where we ended in black, which is good news because it means those concentrations were reduced. But it also is an indicator that they were present at the start. And this became a big focus for me as I was finishing off my degree and finishing off my research, is how we were going to contend with these differences across different samples. Another key thing that came up was how much energy is consumed during treatment. So for reference, insert is what we nicknamed the reactor, in-Situ remediation technology, I think. And pump and treat is indicated by this PT. So we came up with systems that were, there's a lot of backstory to this, but the short version is we wanted to show each an in-Situ insert system and an ex-Situ pump and treat system operating under as optimal conditions as we could come up with, and compare them rather than comparing on a volume or a time basis, because that tends to favor one or the other. So when we compared a pump and treat system to carbon and the electricity consumption that we estimated there versus estimated electricity consumption for the reactor, we found that the pump and treat system used more energy overall because you are pumping water above ground, you're pumping water through the system, etc. Whereas two insert reactors used in tandem could you process treat to a certain point with less energy. There's certainly room to dive into this a lot more and take a much more detailed look, especially with results from any pilot work that is to be completed. And that would certainly add a lot more information that could very well change this analysis and could flip blue to yellow. And that's something really important to consider. And one of the reasons we specifically were looking at in-Situ. So I know I packed a lot into this presentation. I appreciate you sticking with me. I wanted to just wrap up while there's still time for questions by saying that again, there's a lot here. Ultrasound can be used to treat PFAS in groundwater. We have results, even more results that show that. And that work continues under Dr. Crimmy's direction. However, the mechanisms are not thoroughly understood and they're maybe system dependent. So the conditions in any given system could very importantly direct the mechanism that's occurring, and that could influence further how we optimize the system for a given site. The design of the reactor and of the system overall is really important to look at in order to have through the lens of the contaminants present. The reaction rate constants, which I really didn't touch on here, so it's probably shouldn't be a bullet point, but reaction rate constants do tend to favor lower flow rate systems. I'm happy to answer questions about that, but essentially what we found was that if we want to implement this in the subsurface, our theoretical work shows that those reaction rate constants are much slower than many other systems, so they will work better and balance better with a horizontal well when we can operate at a lower flow rate, so particularly in lower permeability settings, which certainly has advantages if that's the site-specific conditions. The energy consumption could be a barrier to developing larger reactors and maybe a reason that this has not been looked at further. And this is particularly true ex-situ as you try to pass, hundreds or even thousands of gallons of water through it in a day. You have to apply much more energy in order to achieve the same or even a better outcome. An in-situ treatment option is probably very feasible. A pilot test is still needed, and I believe Dr. Crimmy has continued to work on that. Sorry, I know that was a lot of information very quickly, but that's what I have. I'm happy to take questions either now or at the end, depending on how we're handling that.
Yes, we can take them now, and there's quite a few that have come in, but I guess going back to the water that you tested, what was the concentration of PFAS compounds in the beginning, before you did the work, and then was that in PPT? Like, what was the concentration beforehand?
Oh yeah, of course. So it was in the groundwater. So because it was site groundwater, the concentrations were not equal between each PFAS present. So just want to be clear about that. So in PPT, we started at about, depending on the site, around 3,000 ppt of PFOA in one case and 4,000 ppt of PFAS. But at other sites we had 500 of PFAS and 100 of PFOA, I believe. I'm trying to remember them off the top of my head. PFBA and some of the shorter chain compounds tended to be present in much lower concentrations, often 200 ppt or less. We did not look at any sites where the concentration was in the tens of thousands or anything like that. I'd be happy to also share, I don't have it with me, but I can send you with the presentation some of that data that we've published. Or is
yeah, there's a poll or something that we could also put up on that webpage. That would be great. So some people are definitely wondering about the practical considerations, and I don't know if you can answer these, but how about, type of soil? If you're doing this in situ, different types of soil might be a problem, or, how would the type of soil affect it?
As far as, yeah, so we did not look specifically in our lab research at soil effects. What I would say though is that if I mean, there's so many interactions that are possible, right? If you may see over time release of certain PFAS from soil, and that could change, and having that, released into groundwater, then you may see, spikes in certain PFAS concentrations, and that is, certainly a consideration, and depending on which were released. So let's say worst case scenario would be all of a sudden a lot of PFAS shows up, regardless of whether it's from soil or from somewhere else. All of a sudden you have this big spike in PFAS concentration. That would certainly extend your treatment time, but if under the right conditions, a large spike in a short chain compound or an intermediate or precursor compound came through, and those were directly degraded, it would not necessarily be an issue. So, assuming I'm answering the question correctly, if this is a question about implementation and digging in the soil, I apologize.
Yeah, well, or like, soil create, be more of a barrier, or I guess slow things down, or you require more energy than a loose soil, I guess.
Oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry. I was way off. So, so as far as flow into the horizontal well, it's actually really interesting because the greater the contrast is between permeability of the well and permeability of the soil, the better the flow focusing is into, the more water can be captured into the reactor. So if you have a really low permeability setting, the well can actually bring in more water because of that contrast. You are creating this preferential flow path. Whereas the higher the permeability, the slower the draw into the well can be. But there are trade-offs there. So if the water is drawn in and is also moving very fast relative to a slower flow rate into the well, and you have to increase your treatment time. So I did a theoretical model of this last year, where I looked at how many reactors we would need to place in line with each other over the horizontal section of the well to meet, certain treatment goals, whether that's 70 ppt or a certain time frame. And what, as flow rate increases, the more reactors you need, or the more you have to control the flow into the reactor so that you have sufficient retention time. I don't know if that.
Okay. So, yeah, so I think, I don't know if you can also comment about, it seems like it's going to maybe sterilize and kill organisms in the soil, but how about other larger flora and fauna, the plants and animals and things like that? Would there be, I guess it would depend on how deep you were, or I don't know what you have any environmental impact of frost.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important question. So in the well itself, so there shouldn't be, just to clear this up a little bit, so there shouldn't be soil drawn into the well itself. So it should only be water flowing through. As far as wave propagation, if the concern was if waves are propagating outside of the well through the materials, there is always that possibility, and you could certainly see an effect. If that occurred, there is a potential for that to have an effect on organisms in the surrounding soil. But this should be occurring, probably 10, 20 feet or more below surface grade. So the waves are unlikely to propagate through the well, through the reactor, through the well casing, back up to the surface to have an effect on flora and fauna. And the PVC well casing as well as the stainless steel reactor, are very likely to have a dampening effect on wave propagation in the soil immediately surrounding the well casing.
Great.
But
and then there's several questions related cost and just energy use, that sort of thing. So can you do a relationship to treat, but I don't know if pump and treat was through a GAC filter. It was, okay. So
yes.
yeah.
So cost as far as the reactor goes, this will vary. So we used a custom transducer from a company in New York that we worked very closely with so that we could optimize the system as much as possible. This was because as a new grad student, I thought it would be fun to just go build it. And ordered some transducers, some small ones, inexpensive equipment to go with it, inexpensive pieces. I got this, don't worry about it. I can build this thing. I cannot build this thing. So we hired someone. And that does cost a bit more. But compared to, I'm trying to think of a good example, but it's so we built the entire thing for $25,000 or less. The energy costs will depend on, and this is how we got into this comparison. So when you look at total time and make a comparison of electricity cost from pump and treat versus the reactor, if you look at total time, it tends to favor the reactor because you can say it's going to run this many hours a day for this many weeks. And, if you say that about pump and treat, and you even just looking at a groundwater extraction pump, if you run that groundwater extraction pump, which has a higher energy consumption, again, that's going to depend on the scenario. So that's why we came up with these optimized scenarios. It's going to increase the pump and treat in comparison. Whereas if you compare by volume, a pump and treat system can pass 1,000 gallons of water through it much faster than an in-situ reactor can. And it's going to take that reactor much longer, and the energy consumption is going to be higher. So as far as electricity costs, the caveat here is that it depends. And so we've got, I'm trying to remember what this comes out to over 30 years in dollars. But the difference is an order of magnitude or so. I got to double check that. I'll include that with my follow-up data. It's been a minute since I looked at this. The second part of the question was how much is actually consumed. Is that correct?
Well, I think I want to move on to a couple other questions, and then we're going to have to move on to the next presentation too. But people are wondering, you're doing this in situ, and it sounds like it's in a well, but you're not pumping the water out of the well, but you're doing it in a well. You're going to have to line up a whole bunch of wells, or you're going to have to do it in a trench. You're going to put a bunch of these in a trench, and just are you going to? What kind of materials is everything made of that you're not going to melt it and that sort of thing?
Gotcha. So horizontal well. Oh, go ahead.
No, never mind. I missed the horizontal well part, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I probably skimmed. I think I tried to cram too much into this presentation. So this is going in specifically in a horizontal well. And what I kind of wanted to clarify was that with the presentation overall was that the horizontal well is a better fit than ex situ. So the horizontal well is drilled and it is passive. So approximately this area of the horizontal well on both sides is screened. And so in combination with the permeability of the surrounding subsurface, the horizontal well passively captures water. If you want more information on how this works, Craig Devine at Arcadis and his team have written several papers along with Dr. Crimi that explain how this works in much greater detail, and have some great figures that illustrate this as well. So the horizontal well passively captures that water and it flows through and it goes back into the subsurface. So this is not an extraction method. The water is not coming in and then going up to the surface in any way, shape, or form. A vertical extraction well people have asked about that as well, why we don't put it in there, mostly because two reasons. We're not looking for a method to extract it. We want to keep the treated water in the subsurface. And number two, that to extract it would have to go very, very, very slowly, and keeping in mind, gravity, we would need to have a good mechanism to retain the water in the reactor long enough in a vertical well to achieve treatment.
Okay. So, and how about just materials that you would these things out of?
So this one, we made this reactor, the whole body is out of stainless steel. It's relatively thin, but it holds up well to cavitation. One thing to consider in design is the distance from the transducer to the opposite wall, so that you don't have pitting occurring because the waves are actually bouncing into it or running into it. So that's one thing. So stainless steel does hold up well as compared to other materials. So we wouldn't use PVC, or, we've went so far as to talk about how could we 3D print this, but we could not 3D print it in plastics because they wouldn't hold up well. As then the well casing, so the stainless steel will be resistant to heat. One thing to keep in mind, and I guess this was our concern for heat control, is that we don't want to damage the transducer electronics over time. So a big thing that we were still working on as far as making this, making implementation in a pilot study feasible, was how do we control heat going, that's produced here and is flowing out of the system, particularly to here. The PVC, a PVC well casing melting is not a concern. We're not reaching temperatures like that. For the sake of the electronics, we're not going above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Ideally, we want to run at about 90.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to move on. There are definitely some other questions, though. So folks can, Fiona, you've got your contact information somewhere on the slides. When the slides are posted, people to get a hold of her.
Yep.
And
Please.
Follow up. But this is something that's still under needs more research and development, but it's very interesting and potentially promising. And now we're going to move on to some sort of more proven and in the field implemented work. So our next presenter is Maureen Dooley. She's got over 25, I just gave you control, Maureen, I think. Okay, there we go.
Can you see it? Okay, good.
Yep. Over 25 years of experience in the environmental industry, including project management, research and development, senior technical oversight, remediation, and laboratory management. Her current position is the Director of Strategic Projects for Regenesis. In her current role at Regenesis, she provides technical leadership for complex soil and groundwater remediation projects throughout North America, as well as remediation design, strategy, and business development in the northeastern United States and in eastern Canada. So with that, welcome Maureen and take it over.
Great. No, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Namoa. And Fiona, that was a really nice presentation. I enjoyed it. It's nice to see, some of these new technologies developing for this really complex problem that we have in front of us here. So the topic of my presentation today is colloidal activated carbon for in-situ remediation. And what I'd like to do is, hold on here. There we go, is review some case studies is really the primary focus of this presentation. And I'll initially talk a little bit about the challenge that we're confronted with, a description of the colloidal activated carbon that's used, and as I mentioned, primarily review some of the work that we've done in the field. So I think, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this upfront area, but I think, we're looking at potential federal regulations coming, under CERCLA for at least PFAS and PFOA, and we have several states that have adopted cleanup standards for, series of PFAS compounds. Some of the obstacles and challenges that we have, just focusing a little bit on the technical, is, we often have, we have a group of compounds where there's 5,000. Now there's many fewer that we're actually looking at or targeted for and have regulatory standards, but there's a lot of material. Quite often they're commingled. We have very low treatment criteria, and it's typically PFAS compounds have been resistant to many of the conventional treatments. So, we're right now, we don't have technologies currently available that, for in situ sort of activities that you can destroy it chemically or biologically, although a lot of really great work is going on. So what we have as available technologies today are going to be groundwater extraction, and that's typically going to have the water pass through some sort of capture, which could be, GAC or ion exchange. And there's a lot of, again, really good work that's going on for some of the concentration of the PFAS and other destructive technologies to use as part of a groundwater extraction system. These technologies typically, have a large infrastructure. You're going to be operating for a long time. And again, it's still going to be really challenging to get to some of these low standards, because it's quite often these may be mass reduction technologies. We also have the concern about the waste stream that may be generated. So if you have GAC that needs to be disposed of, what do we do? Is we're getting, some limitations on what's available, either in landfilling or incineration. So what I want to discuss is an option for in situ remediation. And I think, what's appealing here is you don't have an infrastructure. We don't have the equipment in O&M. What may be a typical application would be some sort of permeable reactive barrier. Say you have, some source here and you have, eco receptors or down gradient wells, and you just want to keep the contamination from moving off site. And these can be designed in situ, to be able to achieve these low standards and also maintain, decades of treatment. I also think it's important to also keep in mind that, while you'd be concentrating, the PFAS contamination, it also is a matrix that certainly may be compatible with future technologies. So we're always looking to some of the work like that Fiona's doing and other people to, further the science, and there may be ways to combine technologies in the future. So what we're applying in situ is a colloidal activated carbon. So the trade name is Plume Stop. And what this is carbon particles that are milled to 1 to 2 micron, and it's suspended in a colloid. The suspension allows us to inject under low pressure and get widespread distribution. So it's something that you can very easily apply using standard technologies, direct push, wells. And what we're really trying to do is convert this, subsurface, the saturated zone into, a filter that's going to capture the contaminants of concern. So the activated carbon will coat the matrix, the aquifer matrix, and then you will have very rapid sorption onto the carbon. And again, as groundwater flows through this zone with the activated carbon, you'll have, clean water coming through the other side. So just visually looking at a sand particle, looking at the scale here at 50 micron, this is sand before we have the application of the colloidal activated carbon. And this shows after, and you see these small particles. This is the colloidal activated carbon. So again, the scale here is at 20 microns. You know, often we'll get questions about changes in hydraulic conductivity. What ends up happening is we coat the surface, and there's actually, with the polymer that we use, a negative charge. So what's going to happen once this coats, as more colloidal activated carbon, is moving through, at the time of emplacement, it's almost, self migratory in a way, because it's going, the charge is going to push it away. So what we end up is with about a 10 micron coating of the sand particle itself. So we don't get this accumulation and agglomeration that's going to have some impact on hydraulic conductivity. So just a very simple visual here. The objective and really the approach is to apply the activated colloidal activated carbon in the subsurface. Again, as groundwater flows through, you get clean water on the other side. It usually takes about 30 days for the colloidal activated carbon to become bound to the soil. So you do, after the initial injection, have some continued transport, through the soil. And say about 30 days. It depends on the soil itself. If you've got more clay and more fines, it may be a little less time. If it's a more sand, gravel, aquifer, it may take a little longer. And we have different formulations with different percentages and different amounts of polymer. And we also, if we need to emplace material, so for instance, if you had a very sensitive receptor here, we can add a divalent cation, calcium chloride, and that breaks up the polymer, and so then you can have the colloidal carbon set up a little more quickly, and keep it from getting to some place you may not want it to go. A lot of questions. Okay, I've got this above ground GAC system. I know stuff breaks through. I don't, why wouldn't that happen in the subsurface? What's different? So what I want to just show here is that there have been some studies that show, in essence, the smaller particle sizes have greater surface area and you have greater efficiency. So that's one part of the equation. The other is, when the subsurface, the flow is obviously much slower than it would be going through a GAC unit. So just in looking at this figure, this is a study that was done, I believe, at Colorado School of Mines. You had activated carbon, at 180 to 500 micron, you get 90% removal versus 99% of something that was less than 53 micron. And this was after, I think it was like 33 parts per billion that were, in a batch test, allowed to equilibrate for 5 days. And this just shows some of the differences in the results, for that. But I think this is also another important piece of the equation, is the kinetics. Again, because you have the smaller particles, you have more exposure. And so what happens is you have a more rapid sorption. So if you have particles that are less than 53 micron versus something that's 500 micron, you see that the rate of sorption is much quicker than it is, quicker for the smaller particles than the larger particles. And, so really, in essence, you get this rapid sorption, because you have, more surface area exposed. And so that, I think, leads to some of the differences in some of the performance, with the small particles and large particles. And I think the smaller particles, my understanding is just isn't as practical for something in an ex-situ system. So another question, this is not a destructive technology. This is a sorption and a capture. So what happens over time? Because clearly there's a finite number of sites that are available for sorption. And so what's going to be critical is, how long is it going to take to fill these sites, and really what does the rate of transport across this barrier look like, after you've applied the colloidal activated carbon. So if we think about the aquifer and retardation factors by applying the colloidal activated carbon, we're in essence changing the FOC and the retardation factor, in the flow of the contaminants through the zone. So for instance, if you have a retardation factor of 1, contaminants are going to flow with groundwater. So if it's 2, it's going to be, half the time. Or if it's a factor of 10, if you have a retardation factor of 10, it's going to take 10 times longer to get, flow from point A to point B. So for some comparisons, natural retardation factor for PFOA is 3 PFOS 19. After we've applied colloidal activated carbon, can range from 500 to 5,000. So what does this translate to? So we look at these different retardation factors based on different concentrations, and you can see the different numbers. But what I personally like, I think is a little easier for me to visualize anyway, is if we had, a somewhat standard barrier with 100 parts per billion, which is pretty high in the PFAS world, of contaminant coming through it at about 160 feet per year, the transit time for groundwater would be, 36 days. The PFOA transit time would be 57 years. The PFAS transit time across the zone would be 200 years. So in essence, you have an engineered control that you're going to keep contaminants from, moving into your area where you have a sensitive receptor. What we do is we will, for design purposes, incorporate the very specific isotherms for individual PFAS compounds or groups of compounds, like you see here, PFAS, PFOA, when we'll group different, size categories. And based on that, we can input, and if this was our barrier thickness, what is the, over time, what's it going to look like going to the other side? So we're able to model this to help us with our designs, so we know how much material is required to maintain a barrier for a fixed amount of time. So in essence, what we're doing is we're going to eliminate the risk by eliminating the exposure. There's plenty of, we have some third party, and I can get information or go to our website and you can find some detailed information on modeling that's been done for some of the different sites. So just to start out with some of the projects that we've been involved with, this first one we often like to refer to as our accidental site. This was a site in Ontario, and we worked with Rick McGregor at in-Situ. And it was originally a petroleum site that was being remediated, and there had been a fire training area. And so just prior to the application of the colloidal activated carbon and actually some ORC to address petroleum hydrocarbons, they collected some data just to see if there were any PFAS compounds there. They only looked for PFOA and PFAS at that time. So we have, a treatment area in this zone, and your most elevated contaminant levels are in the red, and this is showing specifically the PFOA. But we had ranges of about, 1 to 3 parts per billion of, each of the compounds. The treatment area, again, it's not going to be particularly large, and we're looking at about, 8 foot on center type spacing. What these figures show up here is actually, this says organic carbon. This is looking for physical measurements of the plume stop or colloidal activated carbon itself. And there was a combustion type TOC analysis that was used to look for this, not just your regular TOC, because the activated carbon to be able to get that analysis. So what we see is with this particular zone, this is at depth, this was our target zone, these are the concentration at depth. This is at 15 feet away from the point, 10 feet, 5 feet, and 2 feet. So in essence, we were seeing within our target zone about a 15-foot radius of influence. This is a it was a silty sand, so it had reasonable permeability, and also that the plume stop was primarily present in the target zone, and that shows where these cores are, and these points refer to the injection points. So the results, This showed the data after 3 years, so we saw a very immediate reduction in the PFAS and PFOA. At about 1.5 years, some data were collected for a larger list of 12 analytes, different PFAS compounds. None were detected. We had one hit of PFAS at 18 months that was just above the reporting limit, and that's the only detection we've had. There'd been some question whether there was some just contaminants, almost lab contaminant, but even regardless, that was the only hit that we've had. And this is showing 3 years. These are the wells, and we are out over 4 years at this point, and still we have not had any detections above the reporting limit. So this is just, an example of, the application. This was a grid application. We had about 96% of the colloidal carbon, into our target zone. We had about 15 feet ROI, and after 4 years, we're still at non-detect. And of course, our BTEX DRO and some of those compounds also remain below regulatory limits. And there's some detailed papers that are available. Costs for this was a very low cost application, direct push, and any ongoing monitoring, versus if they had used a groundwater extraction system, you see that there's just significant difference in the price. Now, I do not say most sites that we're looking at now are not $73,000, so I don't want to assume that that's going to be the case. If you've got a 6,000 foot barrier, it probably will not be that low cost. Next, a site local to New England, the solvent recovery site that some people may be familiar with. There's a lot of activity that had happened at this Superfund site in Connecticut. There was a landfill, lots and lots of source material, chlorinated solvents. There had been extensive activity, including a pretty major thermal treatment that had taken place. After that treatment, they found that there were some PFAS compounds present, and I'll show you the figure in a second. It'll make some more sense to this, but just to show you, we had about 148 parts per trillion, and let me get to a figure. So this was the landfill that was above here. There was a groundwater extraction system, and so once the chlorinated solvent part of the program had come to completion, the idea was there was a sheet wall, a sheet piling here, is to perforate that, allow groundwater to continue to flow. You have natural attenuation. At the down gradient end here, there is another groundwater extraction system that's in place, and that groundwater is put into, sewer discharge. So when we found the PFAS, they did not, the idea was to try to avoid having a treatment system here for PFAS on this end of the plume. So we had colloidal activated carbon and some ZVI were applied into these 2 trenches. There's a trenches and there's some laterals also that go off of the trenches. And that was to reduce the concentrations of PFAS as well as some low-level chlorinated solvents that were still present in groundwater. So just showing just some of the early data that came up, after the initial injection. This is within the trench, and this was applied, trying to remember, it was like the end of June or early July. We saw a pretty rapid reduction, or actually this is the point, this is our baseline, really rapid reduction in some of the PFAS compounds, and these were some of the VOCs. And this was just, immediately after. So this is 10 feet down gradient. We see again the same sort of trend. And then when you get a little farther down gradient, 50 feet down gradient, and groundwater is flowing at a pretty good clip here, is probably going at least a foot per day. We did start, it was a little bit more of a lag before we saw some of the reductions in some of these compounds down gradient, but we've had, clear reductions. So what happens at this site is that based on the reductions that were observed, they were able to move into an annual monitoring for the PFAS compounds. And so to date, the target wells have remained below the standards that have been established for the site. I know they have another sampling event that is coming up probably this month so that'll be a year out. So at least as of 2020, the standards had been maintained. But what this allowed the folks to do at this site was to shut down one of the groundwater extraction systems, that was associated, like right down gradient from the landfill, and have some, pretty significant cost savings. So let's see where I'm at time here. Okay, so last case study, and this one I like because we're going to show a little bit of some of the field application aspects of this. So this is Camp Grayling. This is a pilot test. There, what we were really focused on here is, dealing with protecting a down gradient ecoreceptor. So some of the site, sand and gravel, so we have, decent groundwater velocity, concentrations about 130 nanograms per liter of your PFAS, about 10 parts per billion of PCE, and our receptors, we had residential and surface water bodies that were of concern. This gives us a, kind of a simple cutoff type, barrier, conceptual model here. And so, we'll get to this next piece here. I think this is what's, what we're looking at for our internal modeling. We use, we input, these parameters, 219 feet per year, these concentrations, and we assume no degradation of any PFAS or any compounds or chlorinated solvents. And the idea is after 75 years, this is what our model shows, that we'd still, the barrier should still be intact. So the layout for this is, so we have about 6 feet between points. These are direct push points, and these are some of the existing wells. This shows, some of the layout here, some of the wells, looking at injection point locations. One thing we also did was, let me go back here, is where we have these direct push points, we also would go and collect cores in the proximity to these injection points to confirm that we're able to see where the colloidal carbon was applied. And so if we look on this figure, our target treatment zone is 15 to 27 feet. And what happened was, we weren't seeing the complete, the black color throughout the entire profile. So it was important for us to, go back, take a look, and make some adjustments. And so after we did that, we were able then to get our target treatment zone. We're seeing that black color, and that was really critical because if we're really trying to create a barrier, we can't have holes in the barrier. We can't, we have to be able to get this distribution. Often we'll do simple things like collect samples, little shake tests, just to look at, what the, how many fines we have in there, and also just confirm the presence of the colloidal activated carbon. And we have some ways to get a rough idea what the concentration would be of the colloidal activated carbon. So this showed where we had the colloidal activated carbon was detected in these searcher cores. Again, just to confirm that. So looking at some of the data, this is a little bit of a different figure. So I'll try to show you, this is considered the up gradient, and in time goes this way. And so this is, closest to the barrier, and these are wells farthest away. So, and this is your timestamp. So you've got some of your baseline. We see very rapid reduction, within, in less than, probably closer to 60 days. Here we are, less than 10 nanograms per liter of the target, contaminants, where we still have it in background. Some additional wells were added to see what was happening moving down gradient. And we also saw groundwater flow was a little different than we actually had initially realized. And so looking down gradient, here we are out at 200, 300, and 400 days. We had a little bit of a detection, but that eventually went down. And we, there's an expectation as cleaner water starts flowing, so cleaner water starts flowing this way, it's going to take some time, to eventually get to, the lower standards. It doesn't happen, immediately. And then here we are out, 500 day, post 500 days, and everything is down at, the non-detect and being maintained. And this shows the corresponding chlorinated solvents. Again, we're seeing very low levels. Again, we see a more rapid reduction here, followed by reduction in wells that are farther away from the barrier. So, just briefly, this is just giving you an idea of the kind of results that can be achieved. What are some things that are really critical to get an outcome like this? We have to really understand the flow and the flux, getting the right information prior to design to know where the contaminants are, where they are, and the vertical, in the vertical profile, so we can focus the applications to cover that. And also it's critical for us to get the distribution of the colloidal activated carbon to ensure we don't have any holes, or it's not Swiss cheese, that we're able to really capture this. And we're able to model to be able to show, to be able to come up with an estimate of the amount of carbon that's needed to be able to maintain the barrier for a particular, a fixed amount of time. Let's see. So, like we say, as far as projects, we've completed 16 applications. We've got at least another 4 scheduled. We're looking at a lot of projects right now. A lot of people are kicking the tires. Not sure if they, what they need to do, but it's, it's an option for people if they're looking, for something that's available now, if they need to mitigate a contaminant plume, cut off a source. It's a technology that's available that's going to be, a little more cost effective than some of the other available options. So with that, and also no waste is generated. So that's another critical piece. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions.
Aha, great. Thank you, Maureen. Maybe just go back to that last slide, because several people came in, that your slide with the resources, because a lot of people are wanting about
I'm going. So somebody put all these animations in there. What's up with that? There we go.
Yeah, so that will be available to people when you get the slides, copy the slides from the website. So, and someone is wondering whether CERDIP, the DoD's work, is doing colloidal carbon, is looking at that. Is Regenesis involved with that work at all?
Oh, actually, I'm glad that question got asked. Yes, we are part of at least 3 programs, I believe. So yes, we had not in the beginning, we were not, because sometimes you apply and you don't get accepted to, but we are part of 3 programs, but we also have been working with industrial clients and other stakeholders to work with projects in the commercial realm. But yes, to answer your question.
Good. So can you speak to site conditions that maybe aren't good for plume stop? So are there limits to depth or limits on type of oil, or anything like that makes the site maybe not where you can do this work?
Sure. I mean, well, basically it's like, what's the flux coming into a barrier? I think the barrier seems to be the most common application that we've looked at. So if you had, exceptionally high concentrations, maybe in some real centered source areas, and a very high flux, very high flow into that, we may not be able to handle it. Some of the Gen X has a lot of the shorter chained materials. So the amount of time we're able to maintain a barrier for that may be more challenging. So you're really looking at the flux, and on the other side, so that's like if you have really high flux and high concentrations, it may overwhelm it. On the other side, are we able to get the distribution that we need? On the really tight materials, really finer grain materials, interestingly, a lot of times there's, if we've got a plume in there, something moves somewhere. So I believe we can generally follow some of those same flow paths because it's like injecting water. We're not fracking it in, it's a low pressure. So those sites can still be ones to consider, but if we can't apply, if we're not can't physically apply the material for some reason, that would make it would be limiting as well. But if as far as depth, if we can drill, if you have an injection well, we have the ability to apply the materials.
Okay. So going back to this issue of, you're going to be collecting all this PFAS in this zone, but then, eventually it might become a source itself. Can you speak to that, or how you?
Yeah, and I think I guess it's the way we look at it's. In one sense, we're concentrating the PFAS contamination that's within the saturated subsurface. So then now what are concentrations? Now I know we were asked about soil levels, and we did the math on, particularly I think it was at the solvent recovery, and weren't going to exceed any soil levels at that site anyway. And so now what? It's really like an engineered control in that the PFAS is there, and it's is slowly moving across. It's not as if it's just going to all of a sudden have this huge breakthrough, but there are you have to understand, we have to understand how long is it going to be there. So I think the idea we're in the time frame of decades. Honestly, the hope is, are there destructive technologies coming along that we can combine with it? Certainly that would be the ideal scenario. I mean, today, if you could dewater it, we could thermal it, but that's pretty expensive, but we're able to engineer this to get into that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, even 60-year sort of containment. If for the sake of argument, you start to see maybe some of your, PBAs starting to show up and a little bit of that, we can always add additional material to extend the barrier as needed. So, I mean, that's the challenge, in that we don't have the destructive mechanism, and obviously we're hoping for that to happen, but we are able to have this engineered control for, an extensive period of time.
Okay, and how about, just assessing and accounting for all the co-contaminants and the natural carbon in the soils, and, just all the other factors besides PFAS and.
Yeah, that's actually another good question. It goes back to, is it feasible and not? What's important, so what we are able to do, what happens quite often is that there are co-contaminants, and so we need to address either petroleum hydrocarbons that might be associated with fire training, or chlorinated solvents is probably what we've seen a little more frequently, honestly. And so we often will co-apply with something that will degrade the co-contaminants. And, so over time, so say we're wanting to maintain this for 30 years, you can go back and apply, electron donor, apply, ZVI, something like that, or electron acceptor, whatever, to degrade some of those components and free up sorption spots for the PFAS. And so we can maintain that barrier. So that's why in many of the projects we'll co-apply, ZVI is something that, the colloidal ZVI we've used quite a bit at the PFAS sites too. So that's something that we can manage those compounds over the extended period of time, and that might require, over time, maybe every 5 years, say, or we can look at what the degradation rates are, and then we can, come up with a program to maintain that barrier.
Okay, so I know we're somewhat focused on groundwater, but how about, have you looked into using the colloidal carbon and stuff for source area treatment, and really sort of trying to get at what's in the source area and getting it to absorb and sort of prevent the plume?
Well, there's one that we're looking at now, kind of is a way to, now I'll answer one question. I know there are some products out there that are for like soil stabilization type products that of course are going to have activated carbon in it and some other materials, that some soil mixing. It's not something we have, but there are some products that are out there. But for our material, I know I'm looking at a project now where we're looking at an application maybe at the bottom of an excavation that's still just above the water table that serve as a way to capture any leachate, to keep it from leaching into groundwater. So I think that's an area we haven't, we're just starting to look at, but there certainly could be potential applications in that area.
Yeah, because some other folks are wondering, if you've got a sort of a source area with a really high groundwater level, but it's maybe not, a huge area, could you just pump
It's something we can look at and see, see what's possible, and if it's not possible, we'll tell you. So, but I think some of
Okay.
to protect groundwater, I think especially if it's something that's a leaching situation, I think there's some ways we could probably help.
And so, we all haven't been focused on PFAS for that long, but what's the longest amount of time that you've got one of these systems in place? And
it's the 4 years. It's the first one. That's probably about 4.5 years. Like, we didn't even know about that job for over a year. They told us after the fact, but yeah. So that's about
that project wasn't even designed to be treating PFAS. It was, but it just happens to be doing.
And honestly, the way we're designing things now, we're applying more material to take up more pore, like effective pore space. We're targeting 60-70% of the pore space at a certain concentration, just to ensure longevity and capture. And so that site wasn't designed anywhere near where we design them now, honestly.
Okay. So let's see. Someone's wondering, so if you tried to put this in maybe like at a landfill site where you're not exactly sure over time of the PFAS contaminants and their concentrations, can you do this at something like that or not really?
Well, we have some default scenarios and we can make some assumptions. I think if so the idea is you may have fluctuating concentrations type thing. Am I hearing that right? And how can you design to that?
Or maybe some PFAS, different PFAS over time. They might not all be somewhat consistent,
Yeah, I think we can try to model things, and it's just like I say model. It's pretty simple model. It does good stuff, but it's we can. I think we can just try to use some judgment and see what what makes sense and what the range of possibilities are.
Okay, and then go ahead.
Yeah, and I think with the landfills, it's important because of what else is coming through. What kind of BOD, COD, and just other demand on the carbon. So that's critical too. That we take that's probably going to take a lot of the demand to make sure we're able to cover that. Because honestly, PFAS is such a small part of it all. Sometimes.
Yeah. And then just this sort of long-term liability situation, in terms of, because it's all staying in the ground and getting bound up there, if you do look 20 or 30 years out, how can we look at the liability then?
Yeah, I think it's just, again, it's like the engineered control. I hate to be like, hopeful about, some of the bug, because I'm hopeful that maybe, some of this bug technology or, some other technologies can come to apply it. It doesn't even have to be perfect. It just to clear out some of the, some of the PFAS that's present, but, just looking at it as the engineered control and being able to just, to manage it until some other treatment technologies come around that there could be some level of destruction. I think, some people like to use the analogy, and it's not a perfect analogy, that with some of, say, metals, metals you make, you're able to, change aquifer conditions, which in essence what we're doing. We're changing the aquifer conditions to have an elevated organic such that you don't have the migration like we change aquifer conditions to deal with the hex chrome. You know, it's similar approach, you know, similar in some ways, but no, I recognize the concern, but I think it's something that we can manage pretty easily, and it's easy to add additional material is needed, or you know, add it, you know, put reagents or additives in to clear out sites that are unrelated to the PFAS, because our expectation is the carbon itself isn't going to you know, change necessarily. But I wish I had an easy answer to say I had a destructive technology at my fingertips right now.
All right. So good. Well, we're at 3 o'clock, and I think I've gone through all the questions that came in from Maureen. So, but she's got her information also on the slides to contact her. And so, like I said, the slides in a few days will be posted on the NMOA website. I'll send a direct link, but you can also just navigate there, NMOA.org, and then go to the wayside cleanup section, and then go to events, and then scroll down, and we've got all kinds of good information here. So, so I really want to thank Fiona and Maureen for presenting today. This was really interesting, and gives us a little bit of hope that we can do something at some of these sites. So, so thank you very much, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day today. So, thanks again, Maureen and Fiona.
Great, thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Bye.